Like and subscribe. Now let's dive. There are very few times on this channel I have gone through like a week of researching a topic and then come out more confused than when I went in. But this is one of those times for sure. In the fall of 1896, which I know sounds like a long time, California began experiencing its strangest phenomena. Not people bent over from fent or massive corruption. It was something floating above their heads, and this is not a UFO or alien video, so don't worry, that's not where this is going. Instead, the people of California were seeing what they described as airships, but not just any airship, ones that were impossible for mankind, massive, machine-powered, and covering hundreds of miles in really short periods of time, with some even carrying entire crews that could be heard talking. And it's worth iterating that in 1896, what these people were seeing was so impossible, almost everyone who didn't see it didn't believe that it was happening. Because heavier than air, engine-powered flight had literally never happened before. Especially because in 1896, that's 7 years before the Wright brothers took flight for the first time and made history. So something has to be going on, right? Making a claim of seeing an airship is like also claiming you met a politician who wasn't corrupt. It's just impossible and outrageous and outlandish. And that's exactly what the Sacramento newspaper published in 1896, that people were outlandish and making up all sorts of stories. That was at least the mindset for a little bit. And if you don't believe me that this actually happened and you think I'm making this up, I'm 100% serious. I also even have the first newspaper reports on this matter, and it's astonishing. For the sake of clarity, let's read a bit of the article so we can know what people were actually seeing. Strange craft of the sky, Sacramento men describe the airship, claim they saw its occupants and heard them in conversation. Sacramento, California, November 18th. The one topic of conversation in this city today has been the reported appearance of an airship over the eastern portion of Sacramento last night. While there are hundreds of people who, failing to catch a glimpse of this mysterious visitant, are extremely skeptical, there are hundreds of people who are positive in their declaration that they did see its brilliant searchlight traveling over the city, and who will also swear that they heard voices of its occupants and distinguished their merry song and laughter. Skipping ahead a little bit, I am certain that this can by no possibility have been a, quote, fake, but that a genuine airship passed over the city last evening. I watched the light until it passed out of sight 30 minutes later. It was traveling unevenly toward the southwest, dropping nearer to the earth, and now and then suddenly rising into the air again, as if the force that was whirling it through space was sensible of the danger of collision with objects upon the earth. I of course had no idea as to its destination or purpose. I can only say that I am fully convinced by what I have heard that it was something out of the ordinary. And then here's a hand-drawn photo of what the witnesses claim to have seen. Needless to say, not your typical Sacramento Tuesday. The article continues by referencing a man named R.L. Lowry, who specifically went on record as stating that he heard the voices of the crew on board and that they were discussing needing to rise higher because they were worried about hitting a church steeple. And then, obviously, because it's California, it wasn't actually a church steeple, but it was the chimney of a brewery. And the guy, R.L. Lowry, was aware of that. And he thought it was funny that these people clearly then weren't familiar with the city of Sacramento. And so I gotta say, if this were a one-off event, I would say, you know what, maybe they were mistaken. Some dude was in his balloon with a candle and was just hanging out. But it's kind of hard to imagine possibly misinterpreting this. Balloons had been around since the 1700s, but there was no such balloon known to man at that time that could have traveled over an entire city and beamed a light that was bright enough to wake people up from their beds. That's something beyond anything known to man at that point in time. But like I said, I could be willing to believe the idea that maybe a bunch of people were mistaken that night or that it was a hoax. But as we continue, it's going to become very clear that that literally just can't be true. And it's worth noting that people were really hyped after this sighting because they thought that after the entire history of innovation, someone had finally conquered the ability of flight, and humans would soon be in the air in the regular. And the final thing I want to preface about this story is that 130 years ago in America, people had hope, which is something we've since lost, but that hope allowed us to create an inspiration, allowed us to create things like the incandescent light bulb, modern engines. We also had the ability to send telegrams, and we had the telephone. And on top of that, people were also creating incredible things like the telautograph, which I'd never heard of, which was basically a machine that you make a call, and then somewhere on the other side of Earth, whoever you want the message to go to, the machine will use a pen and it'll write down what you're saying for the person. So it's like an OG fax machine, which made me realize two things. One, I want to go back. It was so much cooler. Two, people in America, after seeing all these innovations, were expecting the ability to fly to be one of the next things that a great inventor would conquer in America. And so it was kind of like on the horizon in most people's minds. There's a book by Jules Verne named Robert the Conqueror, or however you pronounce the name. And that was all about a guy in an airship who travels around the world. So people were kind of getting primed to this idea already in America. So when they saw airships, they were like, oh, that kind of makes sense. Someone must have been working on this. And so there was also this notion then that the inventor was going to come out if this was real and people were actually seeing what they said they were seeing. Indeed, as this thing grew, the whole airship situation, people began becoming very curious and a little frustrated no one had come forward yet. And people began accusing Thomas Edison of being the inventor because he was such a great inventor at the time, that Thomas Edison had to come out and go, yeah guys, it's not me doing this, and I also don't think that the ability to fly may even be possible for man. And so people had to keep looking. Also, Hiram Maxim of the Maxim gun was speculated to be the inventor, but like I said, no one ever came forward from these original Sacramento sightings. And as I said, sightings, because Sacramento would be one of dozens and maybe even 100 plus towns in California that would actually end up seeing this airship in 1896. And with the increased sightings, it does happen to take on a new life, where people began noticing that there were not one variety of airship, there were a host of varieties of airships. And across the towns and rural plains and cities of California, people would verify this original description of the airship, but then we'd also hear things like airships that had wings. Indeed, in a single evening, just a couple of days after the initial November 18th sighting in Sacramento, an airship was seen flying over northern California cities like Santa Rosa, Chico, Sacramento, and Red Bluff, all in the same night, which means that this thing is breaking travel records as well for man. Interestingly though, as we can see, the first one was kind of steampunk-esque, and it was almost like an egg, which is a common description of these ships at the time. But the people of the state of California began also reporting an almost cigar-shaped ship that was flying around towns, and that would get low at times as well, even circling within a couple hundred feet of the ground. And if you know anything about contemporary sightings, although I don't believe they're aliens, cigar-shaped is a very common description. In addition to the different types of ships being noticed, citizens began also noticing that there were weird patterns to the flights. It didn't seem like there was a pattern to the cities, but several of these ships would then be seen going consistently north towards Mount Shasta, where some believed that the inventor resided and that the airships were being hidden. On November 18th or 19th of 1896, a man named Colonel H.G. Shaw, along with his friend named Camille Spooner, who was a young gentleman assisting him with a business endeavor, they were stopped in the road in their buggy by a craft in the middle of the road and three strange figures standing outside of it. Now, I'm just noting that Shaw's encounter occurred. Now, we're going to get more into the story because it is bizarre, but if we go into more of it now, it's just going to throw us off course. But Shaw also noted that the aircraft had an almost egg-like shape, like others had seen. November 20th and 21st, the sightings continued, once again over Sacramento, with hundreds of more people, including the deputy sheriff and district attorney of Sacramento, seeing the ship this time. And people were beginning to think that this might become a regular phenomenon, and everyone wanted to see it, so they were looking out. And unsurprisingly, we're now getting some more reputable witnesses. The witnesses of the airship this time then described the light as being twice as bright as your typical arc lamp or train light, both of which are incredibly bright, especially for 1896 standards, so that's really saying something and suggesting there might even be a more powerful electronic that this inventor has come up with for guiding the airship. Even stranger though, the ship continues moving over the city like it was nothing. It was just strutting by and beaming its light back and forth, just looking around. And yet, no one tried to investigate more deeply than just looking at it. I'm also a little shocked that in California in the 1800s, no one tried taking a pot shot at it. I mean, that place was filled with all sorts of people, and many of whom would have been in possession of a firearm. I just find it shocking nobody tried to take a shot at it. Eventually, though, it would fly over the house of the mayor, who at the time was a man named Adolph Sutro. Although he didn't see it himself, his entire serving staff and his daughter did, and then he would go on later on record in the papers saying that he was vouching for them and what they saw, and that he believed it because of no one could have faked this, and they were all reporting the exact same thing. And then the serving staff added to a newspaper that they had seen the light and that it was so bright that the seals on the beach, when the light passed over them, they were woken up from their sleep and frightened so bad that they all dove into the ocean and disappeared. Pausing here, the airship then flew over something called Cliff House, which is an achievement because of how tall it is, and it's worth noting that would mean this airship could sustain some pretty serious weather conditions because of all the wind up there. And it was on the coast, so even more windy. But also, in case you weren't aware, this is what Cliff House used to look like, and it was back when we had beautiful things in this country. And then Cliff House was torn down after a couple of fires and an explosives incident, and this is what was built instead. Thought it was worth noting that we've been robbed of so much beauty in this world. Dramatics over, back to the story. With the airship making its way across some of the most well-regarded cities and monuments in California, as well as even cutting close to politicians who could have interpreted this as a threat against them, it shocks me that no investigation was conducted. But seriously, much like the balloon of 2023, was it? That passed all the way over America. Nothing ever happened. They never did anything. And so the balloon was just left to go by its own devices. Ow, my leg just fell asleep. There were a host more sightings at this point in November. I mean, we could read newspaper articles for hours just on those first ones. However, I think the next most important thing to reference is the November 29th sighting. In this case, there were hundreds of residents who saw this in Tulare, California, and what they described was an airship just making its way by, the same one that had been in the news, except for this time they were now red, white, and blue lights. No one else had reported at that time seeing other colored lights, so I don't know what this can mean. It almost seems like air traffic control lights, but obviously it doesn't make sense because air traffic control didn't exist. But it is just bizarre that they were adding new things to the ship as it continued sailing over, which makes me then think that within California this person might have been located, because if the ship's getting upgraded, they gotta have some place to do that, right? It then darted away though, and it wasn't seen again for quite some time. Because it was around the end of November, early December, that the airship just disappeared entirely. Apparently the guy went on holiday, and the guys went on holiday, and no one saw the airship. And so by 1897, January, early January, people were kind of forgetting that this thing had existed, or being like, man, maybe it all was just some weird hoax or mistaken identity situation. And with that same idea, people became a little bit sad because seeing the airship had been like a status symbol for towns. They were all looking forward to it and were almost offended when they didn't get a visit, or if they didn't get a visit from the airship. It was the thing to talk about, and people wanted to be able to talk about a new account. But as stated, the ship was gone. That wasn't until late January, early February, when it began being sighted once more. But in early February of 1897, it wasn't in California that it reemerged. Instead, it was in the Midwest. It would begin in Nebraska, but eventually over time, it would make its way over hundreds of towns. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people would see it, and it would become a global phenomenon. There are actually newspapers from foreign countries that were discussing the bizarre American airship that was flying everywhere. It's almost like going viral, except for in the 1800s. And this does sound cool, and in many regards it is cool, this airship thing. But I am going to warn you that it's going to get downright weird, bizarre, and kind of creepy and eerie as 1897 dawns, because people begin accounting for some different findings. As we know, even in 1896, November of, that the ship was flying far beyond the speed of anything that really was known to man whatsoever, even trains. For instance, we know of a report where it was seen in Tacoma, California, and then 30 minutes later it was seen in San Jose, California. Those two cities are 750 miles apart. So either the ship is going 1,500 miles an hour, or there's more than one ship, which is going to explain how the same ship or same kind of airship could be seen in Middle America in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different places all at once, or within such a time range as otherwise impossible. For 1897 though, the most prominent places to see the airship were Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Indiana, parts of Ohio, Illinois, and Tennessee. As such, we have over 1,500 bona fide reports of this airship from newspapers of that time, and I speculate that there are likely thousands, maybe many thousands more, as so much of the newspaper material of that time has been lost, and even if it was preserved on microfilm, that has been lost, meaning we don't know just how many people have actually seen this thing. It could be far more than we think, but I estimate the number to be at least 1 to 200,000 people. That being said though, that would mean there's also a crap load of reports, and we're not going to read all of them. We literally don't have the time, unless you guys are really curious, in which case I will make a follow-up on this video and read some more reports, but for now we're going to stick to some of the juicier ones that I found. First though, it's worth noting that many people who saw these airships could only make out the lights because of how bright they were, not the ship behind it, whereas other people could in fact make out the ship as they were on a different side of the light, or the light wasn't shining that bright that night, and they could see some things that just don't make sense. We've mentioned that there were the egg-shaped ones with propellers, as well as the cigar-shaped ones, but there were also giant ships with wings, sometimes multiple wings, and like balloon and propeller systems. The sort of stuff that almost makes it look like a boat just flying through the air, which I mean, okay, I guess that could be your interpretation of flying in that time. But people also describe seeing things like the cockpit was made out of glass and some light metals, and you could see the people in there, saying that there were people flying these things. All this to say, though, is that these ships were in all varieties, shapes, sizes, and colors. And on average, though, we do have a general range of them being 10 to 60 meters long, or 30 to 180 feet for those of you who are illiterate. Just kidding. Meters for losers. And most of these ships were also reported as having at least one rudder. But if that wasn't all strange enough, there are also people who reported seeing one of these ships, and you have cases of dozens or hundreds of people seeing this, but some of these ships were pushing 200, 300, and even 400 feet long and over 100 feet in diameter. That is a feat, to say the least. The Titanic was a little under 900 feet long, so you're telling me you're seeing an airship that is just under half the size of the Titanic in terms of length and a very similar height. That would be insane, and having that float through the air in 1896 would be blowing minds, obviously. So it's not the sort of things that someone would forget, especially when many someone see it at once. But also, reporting such grand and colossal creations meant that when they first hit the news was brutal. They were telling people that they were stupid, or that they were just drunks and were asking what kind of whiskey they drank that allowed them to see and hallucinate airships. So like we can see, the media of then and today both suck. But slowly, as this thing spread from Sacramento to other California cities, and then in 1897 to other parts of America, newspapers began going from, okay, these people are idiots and drunks, to, okay, what actually is going on here? And there were a bunch of people who really did investigate this seriously, and people who put their reputations on the line. And slowly, as this grew in people, it also grew in the number of reputable witnesses you had, from business owners to politicians to governors to mayors to engineers, to people who would have been in the know about even the remotest ability to make something like this, electricians, and no one could really figure out what was going on, but they were all claiming to see it and knew that what they had seen was true, and hundreds of others had seen it alongside of them. And it is pretty cool to see that basically all the names that are listed in these newspapers, if you look them up and do your research, you can find that these were real people that lived real lives. That just adds a sort of credibility and cool factor and kind of like a nostalgia to this story, where these people were really there and they were really experiencing this. These aren't just made up names with no one behind them. I was even able to find a historic house of one of these guys who's mentioned in here, which is pretty awesome. And all of this does go to prove the fact that they were real, these accounts, and that these airships were real, because there's just too many people that are seeing it and too many reputable witnesses that are seeing it for it to be anything less. But with these growing reports and growing confidence in the reality of these airships, you also have people who were taking advantage of the story. We have charlatans like one in Nebraska who was charging 25 cents to see his flying machine, but it was later discovered just to be a fraud. And he had, over a few nights with a couple of buddies, bought some metal and some propellers and a little engine, and then started showing it to people and saying that it could fly. Obviously it couldn't fly, and that was a giveaway, and people were pretty angry. But the media would run with stories like this, saying that because there's one fake, that must mean that they were all fakes, which obviously is stupid, but nonetheless they tried, and tried for a while to write this story off. And so I think we're going to skip from 1896 and officially enter 1897 with our first story that took place on February 3rd of 1897. It is the first undeniable link to the airships reemerging, and this was in Nebraska after the last spotting in California, with the Norfolk News taking up the old style of blaming the witness as being a drunk, saying the following: "It would be interesting to know just what brand of liquor the Hastings correspondent drinks that enables him to see airships carrying powerful lights gyrating about through the atmosphere. It must be a remarkable brand of goods, and if it would have the salubrious effect of enabling one to see his pet mortgage floating away, we would be glad to try a few gallons or so." But it wouldn't take long for this paper to receive the proverbial pimp slap into the face, rings and all, as on February 5th of 1897, the Oklahoma Daily Bee reports a ship that was in the town of In Valley, about 40 miles south of Hastings, where it was first located. And the sighting was far more detailed than anything before. And not only that, but the people on the ground could hear the voices of the crew and its passengers, and even laughter coming from the ship, and to top it off, a distinct engine noise. And the onlookers also reported that it had been conically shaped, 30 to 40 feet in length, and had one big front headlight, presumably for navigation, and 6 smaller lights, 3 on each side. Not only that, these witnesses saw 2 wings on each side, and on top of all of that, a robust propeller-like fan on the back. The witnesses were 10 people walking back in a group to their homes from a prayer meeting, all of whom were dedicated to sobriety, meaning that the tainted liquor excuse has now flown right out the window. And all 10 witnesses corroborated this very story. And Once again, let's reiterate, what these people saw is utterly impossible for 1896, based on our version of history, that is. And it does continue with other people seeing these same airships and even going on the record with their name and address and saying, yeah, I saw this, come at me, bro. Basically. The paper describes this man, Thomas Hazel, who gave his address, as being a man who holds a responsible position with the Hammond Packing Company and is considered trustworthy in every respect. High praise for 1897 for sure. There are even instances where editors and reports who had originally mocked the ideas flipped on a dime the moment they couldn't deny it any further. Like on February 19th with the editor of the Daily Hub who published a story about someone who had reported their sighting to him and basically spent the whole report making fun of this guy. And he said of the witness that I, Mr. Reporter, was once just as gullible as this witness, but I know better now. And then the very next day he published a new story, kind of almost an apology, stating that a real, reliable, undeniable witness from a town just a little bit over had now also seen the airship, and he could no longer deny it, that people were seeing it. From this point on, the airships became a phenomenon. It wasn't just people in California on the lookout for them and feeling bad if they didn't get a visit. It was people across most of the US at this point. From coast to coast, people were hoping to get visited by this thing. With groups and friend groups even forming airship spotting parties where they would literally just bring a bunch of your friends and then we'll go out to a high point around the city and we'll bring snacks and watch and see if we can spot it. Meaning that there's likely more than 100,000 people who saw this thing, because you're bringing your friends, the numbers could be even higher than what I speculated. It is also put forward that there is a noticeable spike in the period of late 1896 and early 1897 in terms of the sales of things like field glasses, which are binoculars, or telescopes. And people speculate this is because people were buying so many more of these items so that they could also look out for the airship and get a better look at it. And with that introduction, I think it's a good point to skeet into some of the bizarre and creepy stories that also surround this very same incident. Because there's all sorts of, oh, I just saw the ship and it was cool and it looks like this, but there are some that go a little bit further. And thankfully, people really did go out and buy these binoculars and telescopes because it allowed them to see some of the things that I presume they now wish they hadn't. The first eerie thing about this story and what these people probably began to suspect and feel is that it is cool that someone has conquered flight, but it's now been many months and no one has come out and taken credit for it. And there's like a kind of an eerie sensation that there's someone who's so far ahead of the technology of the time, but no one's taking credit for it. So what's going on, and why are they actually flying over these towns and cities? And why are they doing the following things we're going to discuss? The following report comes from Table Rock, Argus, which is in Nebraska, on April the 16th of 1897. The mysterious airship was seen in Table Rock Tuesday night by reputable citizens. It was going from the southeast to the northwest and seemed to be about 20 by 40 feet in size and so brilliantly lighted that it lighted the sky for a great distance around it. Over Table Rock it was going very slow, seemingly almost at a standstill, as though something unusual was transpiring on it. There were windows in the side and the passengers seemed to be hurrying to and fro about its compartments. Just how many persons were on board could not be ascertained, even with the aid of a powerful glass brought into operation, but there were at least 2 ladies in the company, one of whom seemed to have her hands fastened as though chained to the seat, and the other seemed to be waiting on her, while the figure of a man holding a huge revolver and sitting directly opposite her, left the impression on the minds of the onlookers that there was foul play aboard. Suddenly the windows darkened, and at the same instant the ship shot out into space so rapidly that in the space of a few seconds it was out of sight, and the awe-stricken crowd looked at each other terror-stricken. It is safe to say most of them fell into a disturbed slumber when they went to sleep, while visions of the beautiful prisoner on the mysterious airship filled their dreams. Those who vouch for this story are among the most reliable citizens and are not given to imbibing bug juice and lay no claims to vivid impressions, and the Argus gives the story for what it is worth. 2 things I want to note there. The first is when it says shot out into space, it doesn't mean space as we say it, it just means into the general atmosphere and sky, and it just went far away. Number 2, when they say that they don't imbibe, they're specifying that because many of these articles were understanding that other news media organizations that wanted to defame people and discredit the story were going, oh, they're just drunks. So then a lot of people would then intentionally place in the story, no, these people don't drink. Okay, that being said, the giant flying object abducting people does sound very similar to some other reports that have now been claimed to be aliens in later years. Once again, I don't think it's aliens. But the case of an abduction, especially one that was then seen by other people, is really creepy. Like, it is admittedly a terrifying thing to imagine. Looking out at this airship that's been going everywhere, and then seeing through the bottom of it a bunch of people, one of whom has just been taken and who was, based on other reports, in some sort of injured state, possibly bleeding, and then having someone with a gun waiting and guarding the person. Like, clearly something else is going on here. It's also disturbing to think that all these people, although they may have wanted to help, literally couldn't do anything. There was nothing they could have done. And the final thing about this story that gave me a chill was that the lights shut off inside of that passenger cargo area, which makes me think that the people outside who are watching were also being watched back by people inside of the airship. It is indeed a strange story, and I have tried to look up and see if there were any missing persons from that 1890s period, but as you might imagine, rural America or any part of America in 1890 wasn't really great about keeping records of missing people, nor was it an exceptionally common thing. So if there was a record, I couldn't find it, but if you can, it's Table Rock, Nebraska. Make sure to give that a look. But this is indeed not the only strange story of an abduction. The next takes place on March 27th into the 28th of 1897 in Topeka, Kansas, when locals saw what I'm quoting as being a blood red light moving at a leisurely pace across the heavens. Several hundred people confirmed that story and what they saw. And it was such a frightening event that people ran and hid in their storm cellars because they thought some sort of calamity was upon them. But Cooper, you said there was another abduction. And trust me, there is, because in the same night, a local farmer was out and about his land when something above him that he hadn't seen or heard dropped down a grappling hook and tried to drag him into the sky. Yeah. So now we have flying ships dropping down things to grab people. Starting to sound familiar, and I'm wondering if there's a connection here. Like I said, seems like maybe a human organization, not an alien one. But, needless to say, the grappling hook grabbed onto the guy and started dragging him, but he was able to escape. There is also the story of a cattle abduction in here, and not just people abductions. This is the story of a farmer named Alexander Hamilton, not the original Alexander Hamilton, but a different one. Prefacing this story though, the son of the guy who wrote this story later came out and said that he was known to be part of a liars club with some other guys, which is where you make up fake stories. However, but in this specific case, it seems like he was really telling something that had actually happened. And as far as I'm aware, the guy who wrote the story never came out and said this one was fake or anything even remotely like that, or that he had embellished it. It was actually his son, some many decades later, who went and said that this was fake. So it's something to speculate upon and to be considering, but I also find it odd that someone 40 years later is trying to discredit their dad. So I'm going to presume that there's some reality to this story, but it is interesting because even if it is fake, this individual did happen to predict something that would become very common, that being cattle abductions and mutilations. Last night, around 10:30, we were awakened by a noise among the cattle. I rose thinking perhaps my bulldog was performing pranks, but upon going to the door, saw to my utter astonishment that an airship was slowly descending upon my cow lot, about 40 rods, 600 feet from the house. Calling my tenant, Gid Hislop, and my son Wall, we seized some axes and ran to the corral. Meanwhile, the ship had been gently descending until it was no more than 30 feet above the ground, and we came within 50 yards of it. It consisted of a giant cigar-shaped portion, possibly 300 feet long, with a carriage underneath. The carriage was made of glass or some other transparent substance, alternating with a narrow strip of some metal. It was brightly lighted within, and everything was plainly visible. It was occupied by 6 of the strangest beings I have ever seen. They were jabbering together, but we could not understand a word they said. Now, right there you might think aliens, but for a guy in rural America, that could be an Italian. And he also would have no idea what Italian sounds like. Every part of the vessel, which was not transparent, was of a dark reddish color. We stood mute with wonder and frights, and then some noise attracted their attention and they turned a light directly upon us. Immediately on catching sight of us, they turned on some unknown power, and a great turbine wheel, about 30 feet in diameter, which was revolving slowly below the craft, began to buzz, and the vessel rose as lightly as a bird. When about 300 feet above us, it seemed to pause and to hover directly above a 2-year-old heifer, which was bawling and jumping, apparently fast in the fence. Stuck in the fence. Going to her, we found some material fastened in a slip knot around her neck, and going to the vessel from the heifer, tangled in the wire fence, we tried to get it off, but could not. So we cut the wire loose to see the ship, heifer, and all rise slowly, disappearing to the northwest. We went home, but I was so frightened I could not sleep. Rising early Tuesday, I started out of my house, hoping to find some trace of my cow. This I failed to do, but coming back in the evening, found that Link Thomas, about 3 or 4 miles west of Leroy, had found the hide, legs, and head in his field that day. He, thinking that someone had butchered and stolen a beast, had brought the hide to town for identification, but was greatly mystified in not being able to find any tracks on the soft ground. After identifying the hide up to be by brand, I went home, but every time I would drop to sleep, I would see the cursed thing with its big lights and hideous people. I did not know whether they are devils or angels or what, but we all saw them, and my family saw the ship, and I don't want any more to do with them. The amazing story was accompanied by an impressive-looking sworn affidavit. And the affidavit is signed by 12 people, and they are supposed to be some of the most reputable people in town and in the state, so take that as you may. This story I have some issues with. I don't think that there were aliens on board, and the ship is described almost exactly as the other ones that are described as traveling across America. So I think if this guy was a known embellisher, if there's a part of the story he embellished, it's probably what these people looked like and sounded like. Or we could also say that maybe these people understood that to travel at great heights you needed some sort of respiratory supply, and they were wearing masks or something, like flying masks. I don't know. There are possibilities that are within the realm of reason as to why these people would have looked so strange. And them speaking gibberish literally could have been any language that wasn't English. So I don't know. I think there's probably some reality to this story, and maybe not, but I am not willing to doubt this one 100% yet, is what I'll say. But as we do know, there were charlatans involved in this story. We even have people like William Randolph Hearst, whose house I've been to, fun fact, way long after he died, obviously. But William Randolph Hearst ran a massive series of papers and was known as a yellow journalist and would publish fake stuff. And it's known and recorded well that on one side of the country, he's publishing the fact that these stories were fake, and on the other, he's publishing that they were real, trying to capitalize on each audience. And you've also got, like we said earlier, the guy who's making fake crafts. There were a number of those who sold tickets. But other than that, for the most part, in fact, probably like 95% of these stories are people's genuine encounters. Only some of them are clearly not. But that 5% of fake stories was enough for many people to discount the whole thing, and it wasn't 1890s poisoning of the well, is one way to put it. And an example of one of these poisoning of the well stories is one that was published on April 10th of 1897 in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and it discusses a man named W.H. Hopkins' encounter, in which he stated that he found a grounded airship 20 feet long and 8 feet wide in the radius of Springfield, Missouri, and it was powered by 3 large propellers and was made of some unknown metallic material. When Hopkins got close to the airship, he states that 2 people came out from it. He describes one of them as being a, quote, beautiful woman, and the other as being a, quote, bearded man, and that they were both completely nude, not a scrap of clothing betwixt them. Hopkins states that he tried talking to them, but it pretty quickly was clear they did not understand what he was saying. Eventually, however, it was the case that they just, according to him, pointed up into the sky and then said something that he thought sounded like the word Mars, but he doesn't actually know what they said. And that story, obviously coming from a larger paper, got a lot of push, but most people didn't seem to believe it. And I don't even think W.H. Hopkins believed it, who I found the actual gravestone for, then reports that these 2 people got back into the ship and then it darted off and presumably went back to Mars, is what he thinks. Now, at first, this does sound like an alien encounter like we might hear about today, but in all likelihood, it's completely fake. And the reason I suggest it's fake is because when people start mentioning Mars or Martians at this time, that's because the idea of Mars was popularized in literature and was being primed in people's minds. So people wanted to take the reality of the airships and connect it to Mars, because they thought combining the two would get them a lot more readers, which is like getting more clicks today. In essence, these sorts of Mars and Martian stories among the airship ones are like clickbait. We have the same problem today, so I guess there's some solace in knowing that 130 years ago there were still clickbait creators. Man, some things don't change, do they? The final story I think we're going to read for and cover today goes as follows. James Southard, a farmer on the bottoms north of Peru, that's Peru, Kansas, was in Auburn on Wednesday and made this office a call. Mr. Southard tells a story which a great many will doubt, and were it not for his reputation as a truthful man, we would hardly care to repeat the story. He has resided in Peru precinct for the past 20 years and has always been known as a truthful and honest citizen. Sometime during Monday, a number of cows belonging to Mr. Southard strayed away from his farm and were not missed until evening. A hunt for the missing cattle resulted in Mr. Southard finding himself several miles from home when darkness came on. He soon became lost and wandered about for some time in the dense growth of willows, becoming all the time more confused as to his whereabouts. About 2 o'clock in the morning, he saw a light on a bar in the river, and finding a place where the bar ran into the bank, made his way to the light. Imagine his surprise when he found that he had stumbled onto the airship, which has attracted so much attention and has been the occasion of a great deal of speculation as to what it really was of late. A number of men were moving about the ship or machine and seemed considerably surprised when Mr. Southard appeared. Nevertheless, they were nothing loath to talk when he had explained how he came to be there. Something had gone wrong with the searchlight on the ship, and not daring to proceed in the darkness, the ship had been brought to the ground. It is cigar-shaped, about 200 feet long and 50 feet across at the widest point. Mr. Southard was allowed to examine as much as he pleased, and all his questions were answered. At each end of the ship is a large steel, snail shell-shaped device. This, he was informed, was the apparatus by which this strange machine was propelled. Large gasoline engines caused whichever one of these in use to revolve rapidly and to bore into the air, dragging or pulling the ship along at a wonderful rate of speed. And here's where the story I really want you to pay attention, because it's going to take a wild shift. The craft is loaded with several tons of dynamite and is bound for Cuba. Spanish troops are being massed in the cities for transportation to the Philippine Islands, and it is proposed to sail over these cities and drop the dynamite into the camps of the soldiers and on the transport ships. Besides destroying the camps and transport ships, it is proposed to destroy the Spanish Navy. They expect to sail or fly to Cuba yet this week and reach there by Sunday or Monday. When they do, Spain is likely to hear something drop. This story could really take us like 1,000 different directions, but I think an interesting one is found if we were to take the words of the crew on board as to what they said to Mr. Southard and it being true. Now, this next part is going to be pure speculation, but it made me very curious because it connected to another topic I've always wondered about. And I want to preface also, having a piece of technology like this would be so stupidly advantageous that people wouldn't even catch on. It would put you in such an excellent position. So bear with me here. The USS Maine incident occurred shortly after this conversation, less than a year later to be precise. And the USS Maine, if you're unfamiliar, is one of the original false flags of the United States. A false flag being an event where the US government stages something to cause a desired result. In this case, the USS Maine, though, was a battleship that was sitting in the port of Havana, Cuba, which at that time belonged to Spain. Now, there was zero good reason for America to be even remotely involved in this conflict. It was not our business, and we're supposed to stay out of that stuff. But the government apparently has always been bad, so we did get involved. And we sent this ship to the Havana port to be kind of like, oh yeah, we can come here if we want to. Try, mess with us, see what happens, basically. And the Spanish actually didn't mess with us. And most Americans agreed that sending something like this ship was stupid because we didn't want to be involved in a foreign conflict. It had nothing to do with us. Like I said, most Americans were pretty sensible at this time. Digressing though, the USS Maine was a sitting duck in this harbor with roughly 400 men on board, and it was surrounded by Spanish military and navy. Well, one evening on the 15th of November, 1898, so less than a year after the last sightings of the airships, a Captain Sigsbee of the USS Maine closed all of the magazines, ensuring nothing could go wrong, expecting no need of ammunition or powder in that hour. Shortly thereafter, it is believed he went to the deck or to bed and took the keys with him. The Spanish ship Alfonso XII knows the rest of the story, however, as several officers were eating in the mess hall when they heard such an enormous explosion as they immediately understood that the ship was lost. They didn't even have to know where the explosion technically came from to know it came from the USS Maine, as they were anchored just a short ways off from it. And right they were. By the time these officers made it to the upper decks, they looked across the water and saw the USS Maine on fire and sinking. And the Spanish Navy, having far more decorum than the United States government, actually lowered many of their own ships into the water and sent a ton of their men to help rescue the American sailors, saving well over 140 lives. Unsurprisingly though, the same papers like William Randolph Hearst's that had been publishing the stories about it being fake, all these airships on one side of the country and real on the other, then took this story and started blaming the Spanish for this explosion, which they clearly were not involved in. They made this story that the Spanish attacked them and sucker punched them or ambushed them in the dead of night, and it was the evil Spanish, the perfidious Spanish, and we have to go to war with them. And really quickly, you have the US government go, yeah, we're gonna have to go to war. And then you have the American people who are now angry about losing all these soldiers going, man, maybe these Spanish people are evil. And it was enough to push America into the Spanish-American War. I'm obviously gliding over the full story. It'll take a while to get into, but you get the gist. Almost 300,000 Americans would be deployed into the conflict, costing over 2,000 American lives. The numbers are a little bit difficult to come by, but throughout the Spanish-American War, we expect that there might have been at least 170,000 civilian casualties on the various islands. After all, though, much of this data was covered up and destroyed. On top of that, about 60,000 Spanish soldiers lost their lives to both war and disease. So we're talking about massive human tolls and massive amounts of money and massive assets that went into this. And for what? A foreign conflict we shouldn't have been involved in, right? But there is a point to this, don't worry. If we're to circle back, Spain was destroyed after this, Cuba was destroyed after this, and America gained control over the Philippines, Guam, a host of other islands, as well as Hawaii we annexed at this time. So the US came out on top of this. Spain was permanently destroyed. You can actually blame a lot of the current state of Spain on this war. And for what reason? The USS Maine, right? That's the only reason we got involved. Well, people, like we referenced, suspect the USS Maine was a false flag. It was so convenient, and there was never an answer given for how it actually was destroyed, that people are like, okay, it was clearly us. The textbooks will deny that, but it's pretty clear. Continuing though, the story of how the Maine sank has changed over the years. First, it was a gunpowder room explosion, maybe ignited by the Spanish, and then it became a story of the Spanish dropping a mine right next to the ship so that it would explode. Who knows? But in all these stories, the Spanish were made the scapegoat. Well, in 1911, I know, what a history lesson, Cooper. What does that have to do with airships? We're getting there. In 1911, the United States government built like a little kind of like dam thing around the USS Maine wreck because it was in such low water that you could still kind of see the mast. So they drained all that water out, and then they looked at the ship and they did a full investigation, because initially all they could do was send people down there to feel it out, and they were like, all right, let's really figure this out. And they came to the conclusion that it must have been internal explosion and or a mine. And practically speaking, that story hasn't really changed much even to this day. They publish in textbooks these lies. But what was noted was that some of the pieces of the ship were bent inwards and others were bent outwards, and it almost seemed like the explosion had come from an upper deck maybe, but no one really ever got to know, because like the government apparently has been doing now for 130 years, the photos were never really given to the public, and the ship that they had just now brought out of the water, instead of maybe putting it on display for us all to see, they destroyed the evidence. They sucked it up out of the water, and then they took it further out to sea and scuttled it there. It now sits under 3,700 feet of water, making it impossible for us to ever really assess what happened to the USS Maine. And like I said, best of fortune if you really want to find all the photos of the crime scene. But to this day, it is still a huge conspiracy because of all of the benefits the US received from this day. It's just too convenient. Well, to this day, people still wonder what the real cause of the explosion was, both on the side of false flag and not. And so I got to thinking, you have these Spanish ships sitting out in port, and months prior you have the last known sightings of these airships, and one of these last known sightings involves the captain and the crew discussing how their airship is going to be used to attack the Spanish, presumably on behalf of the United States government, and how they had all this dynamite and that they were going to make sure the Spanish heard what happened. And on that night, the Spanish did in fact hear the explosion of the USS Maine. Now, I don't know, this is speculation, but I do find it a very curious fact that no one that night saw the cause of the attack. No Spanish ship fired at them, there was no reason for the gunpowder to explode, and there was no mine or mine-related materials ever discovered. But something that would explain what actually happened to the USS Maine and why no one saw the evidence would be if you had an airship sitting at 1,500 feet above the ship, and it had dropped a bunch of dynamite like it had on board onto the ship, exploding the ship, and then also igniting the ship's powder room and ammo room, causing another explosion. And a little bit more evidence for this idea that these airships were being used in war is two things. They only ever appeared at night on the American continent, and the USS Maine exploded at night. And the other thing is that this is not the only time the Spanish and the Cuban War is referenced in these articles and in these reports. Other crews of airships also said that they were en route, or that they were involved in the Spanish-Cuban conflict. So who knows? That is totally speculation, could be completely wrong, but there's enough going on there that makes me curious if the US government was using these pieces of technology to their advantage. Because the US government's really the only people who could have afforded to create these ships and then also kept it secret for so long. I don't know. I wanted to get that out there because I'm curious if that's involved, and if someone knows something, please let me know. That'd be fascinating to know more. But like I said, that really is all speculation and it's just a guess. But let me reiterate it again. They said the following. They propose to destroy the Spanish Navy. They expect to sail or fly to Cuba yet this week and reach there by Sunday or Monday. When they do, Spain is likely to hear something drop. It sounds like they're talking about military orders with the reference that they expect to sail or fly to Cuba yet this week, as if they don't know for sure. Circling back more specifically to the airship story as a whole, it becomes very clear that there is a group of people who has this technology to travel at least 100 miles per hour, maybe more, and cross the entire continent in just a couple of days. A sort of technology that will put you so far ahead of everyone else. I cannot explain in any other way how these people could have seen this, but it does seem like these airships are real. And I get the eeriest feeling knowing that there are all of these people involved in the disinformation campaign as well, like Hearst, but then there are also other spooks involved in this. There are people who came out with stories like they saw an airship and then someone had a button and it shrank into the size of like a coin and he fit it in his pocket. Things that are clearly false. And these stories were getting pushed oftentimes more than the real airship accounts. So then you have two disparate stories going on. You have the airships that are aliens or Martians that are flying into space and they fit in your pocket. Or you got the story of these very real airships that are being seen by prayer groups or by hundreds of local people in their own town flying over. I later learned that this very same ship was actually reported in the local newspaper of where my grandparents were from. So I don't understand what else this could be, but I do understand that there is a lot of embellishment that happened when it came down to the people that we would call a spook. There are examples of this spook interference. Like we have the earlier example of H.G. Shaw, that colonel, who encountered something that I said we're gonna have to save for later because otherwise it would throw this whole story off. Well, what Shaw saw, he said, was a smaller aircraft, A-shaped, 20 feet long, and there were 3 7-foot tall beings who got out of it, and they made a warbling noise at him and tried to get him to come with them, but they were too weak to lift him, but that when Shaw tried to lift them, they only weighed like an ounce. And in this case, H.G. Shaw is someone who had a deep government connection, who is now making up what we know to be a fake story. But that, however, is shockingly not even nearly the only example of a spook getting involved in a story and trying to change it or trying to create an entirely fake story to throw people off the scent. For instance, you have this later case that has become huge in the UFO community as being an example of aliens, when in reality it's likely an example of something completely different. And that is the case of the Aurora, Texas crash. And the newspaper description goes as follows. Aurora Wise Co., Texas, April 17th. To the news. About 6 o'clock this morning, so when it was still dark, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which has been sailing through the country. It was traveling due north and much nearer the Earth than ever before. Evidently some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the Earth. It sailed directly over the public square, and when it reached the north part of town, collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank and destroying the judge's flower garden. And we know this has to have been one of many airships if this crash happened, because more airship sightings were reported after this, even on the same days across the country. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one on board, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Mr. T.J. Weems, the United States Signal Service officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that he was a native of the planet Mars. Papers found on his person, evidently the record of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and could not be deciphered. The ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal, resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver, and it must have weighed several tons. The town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck and gathering specimens of the strange metal from the debris. The pilot's funeral will take place at noon tomorrow. S.E. Hayden. Okay, so this is like one of the most infamous cases of an alien ship crash in the UFO community, like we said, because it seems to be the story of an actual Martian coming to Earth. But in reality, it actually is not. This is a bona fide example of the airships, but it has nothing to do with aliens. I'm going to tell you why. That whole story seems to match up exactly with the other airships. You have machinery, you have something that is traveling using air in some capacity, using a gas of some kind, as well as propellers, and very human technology. The only parts of this story that shift are when this guy named T.J. Weems comes in, and then the story seems to take on some ethereal dimension. The only thing about the story that isn't plausible, based on the other airships, is the description of the pilot, who's then described as being a Martian. But this information and this evidence for him being from Mars comes from a man named T.J. Weems, and T.J. Weems is noted as being a United States Signal Service officer. Now, if you're not familiar with the Signal Service, it kind of blows up this whole story of it being a Martian, because the Signal Service is a precursor intelligence agency, kind of like an 1800's CIA, and these groups were known to be involved in military intelligence and other sorts of clandestine operations. So the fact that we have someone who's going from telling a story of a genuine airship crash, like all the other airships we've talked about, and suddenly it's a Martian, and this guy happens to be a government agent in a 3-letter-esque type agency, yeah, I don't really believe the Martian part then. Especially because we know that Martians don't write on paper, and Martians don't use propeller-based ships to fly around the Earth. So I speculate that thankfully this newspaper mentioned it, but this T.J. Weems guy was just a complete spook and made up that part of the story. Also, the hieroglyphics Could have just been any language that wasn't English, so people just were confused by what they were reading, as basically that, and this guy just embellished the story. We also have some more evidence that this story has been embellished upon, because you can look at the record of investigations of the Aurora crash incident. The UFO community has been very curious about this one for so long that multiple shows have gone and looked into it, and many people have looked into it. And what they've found was that the pieces that weren't taken by the locals after the crash were all tossed into a well, and that well was then covered up with a 6-inch slab of concrete by the well owner. And on top of that, there was a grave where this body of the traveler was buried. As it turns out, when people came to investigate, like these shows, they got permission from the owner of the land to remove that 6-inch cap from the well, and they tested the water, and it was extremely high in aluminum. And the ship was proposed to have been made out of aluminum. On top of that, they went and scanned for where the body was in the graveyard, and on it there was a creepy etching of what looked like a ship with 3 lights on the side of it, which matches that way earlier description that those 10 people leaving the prayer meeting gave us of a ship with 3 lights on the side of it. Well, they go in and scan using ground penetrating radar, and they find that there is actually a corpse in there, as well as possibly some metal pieces. And so what's speculated is that there is a body down there, but the body down there would show us that it was likely a human, and that this human was just smaller because, he's an early airship traveler. I mean, you pick jockeys to ride horses because they're smaller. I imagine we're not exactly building airships for people my height, so it would make sense that it would be a smaller person. Also, it's possible that they got some foreign inventors involved in this, and that's why the guy was writing in a language that didn't make sense. And on top of that, the fact that this body was never allowed to be exhumed makes me curious, because for all we know, it could just be a regular dude down there, and we could find out some pieces of information that help alleviate the whole airship story. And on top of that, after this UFO show went in and did this investigation, someone went and stole the gravestone from the grave, making it way more difficult for us to ever find who and what was actually buried there. But if you are curious, you can find the information on where this body is supposed to be. I'm deeply curious about this because I think that corpse, although this story has been spookified and embellished, I think that corpse could reveal to us a lot of the truth about this airship situation. And it would make the most sense that these were just normal humans who were in possession of advanced technology, perhaps through the government where they had been working, and were just test driving ships, and this happened to happen. Because only a few of these accounts actually report it being as Martians, and the rest do say that they're humans. So who knows? For all we know, there could be nothing there. For all we know, there could be something crazy there in Aurora. But no matter what, it is a very curious addition to this whole story. That all being said, though, I think I'm going to be done telling the stories or some of these reports, because I kind of want to get into the final section of this, which is what do we think actually happened? Clearly something was happening, and that's what frustrates me the most, is that at this time, the 3 main things that the media was saying to try and discredit this whole story was, one, that they were just drunks, which doesn't make sense. The other really common thing that people gave as an excuse for what was being seen were meteors or falling stars, which doesn't really match up at all. And 3, a really common excuse that was given at this time that this really wasn't happening was that people were mistaking airships for the planet Venus, which is so stupid. That doesn't even make sense. How am I going to mistake the abduction inside the glass-cased section of the airship for being the planet Venus? That doesn't make any sense to anybody. Really annoying that no good excuse was given, and really if I was to add a 4th thing that was told that was why this whole thing must be fake, it's because there were several charlatans, like the guy we referenced earlier, selling tickets, as well as people who were saying that these were Martians. Obviously that's ridiculous. And both of those things were successful in discrediting the story for a lot of people. There were just too many people though who had seen these things for it to actually be successful in discrediting the stories, because you can't convince hundreds of thousands of people that they were wrong about what they saw with their own eyes. At least not easily. And perhaps the strangest thing to me about this story, besides the fact that you have these airships flying around, is that you've also got this weird fact that you have to kind of get over of how have our ancestors never told us about this? How have our grandparents not told us about their great-grandparents' encounter with the airships? Because a lot of people have seen it. Like I said, it even passed over where my grandpa lives. Which makes it even more mysterious than how we have only the written newspaper record of these airships, and only some of those newspaper records of these airships. I'm sure if we kept looking we'd find more, but many have probably been destroyed or lost to time. No book of the time seems to include these records. It really is just these newspapers, which is why the story shocks so many, because it's not very well known, despite having all of these newspaper accounts and reports that contain and maintain that this story really did happen. So I don't know if it was just a case of the actual powered flight did exist not too long after this, so people just kind of forgot about it, or if there's something larger at play. But it only adds to the curiosity that so few people know of this story, and that it only exists in newspapers. And because of that, over time, many people have tried to paint this story as just being some fake newspaper hoax, but I do find that there's far too much evidence to believe that. And so I go and I wager on the side of this really did happen, and these airships were very real, and something beyond our conception of history was at play. That being said though, I want to know what you think, and if you've heard of these airships, or if you have family who has stories of these airships, because I really want to get more information out there about this. This one never ceases to blow my mind. That all being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I can't wait to see each and every one of you in the next one. My back hurts so bad.